Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. If you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otap, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Goddamn that money, hear what I say.
Them boys don't want no drama.
Said I'm all about drama on a holiday.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now. Thank you to all who donated during our August fund drive. We are back in regular programming. Our central theme today covers Afro-Indigenous solidarity under U.S. imperialism, from mainland indigenous to Hawaiian indigenous, and the solidarity and struggle to fight against the poisoning through waters of Black and Indigenous communities today under United Snakes, imperialism, and military focus on Ukraine and China. Today's interviews focus on history. Our agenda for the week of September 3rd, 2022. We commence with our sister, Luyanda Kuboka, and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. This hour, Freedom Now co-producer, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Kyle T. Mays, assistant professor of African American Studies at UCLA, here to discuss his book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Then, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin, professor at Quinnipiac University, here to discuss her book, Black Indians and Freedmen, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and Indigenous Americans from 1816 to 1916. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, 79ers Gang, Art Blakey, John Coltrane, Benny Golson, Babel Valdez. So sit back, tell a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
Them boys don't want no drama.
Alafia to our KPFK listening audience. I'm Sister Luyanda Kuboka with our weekly African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for this week, September 5th. The recent human crisis in the Middle East demonstrates the critical need for us to learn from the successful struggles of bygone eras. We need to map out our future as African people and the poor and oppressed by building on the successful revolutions that have characterized humanity. Hopefully, the following struggles will provide a dark light in the sea of white blinding racism, which is at the fundamental foundation of U.S. society. September 5th, 1905. Africans leave Oklahoma and immigrate to the remote area of northern Alberta, Canada, seeking freedom from the segregation and lynchings in the United States. September 5th, 1877. Crazy Horse, whose traditional name among the Lakota Native Americans is Tashunka Oitko, was one of the greatest Native American resistance leaders. Through an alliance by marriage with the Cheyenne, they defeated numerous U.S. Army forces in battles in the Black Hills, Little Bighorn, and throughout Wyoming. Tashunka Oitko Crazy Horse was never defeated in any war with the U.S. military. September 6, 1912. Ella Gray was born in Tallahassee County, Alabama. She was a socialist organizer among Southern sharecroppers. At the age of 19, she became a leader of the Sharecropper Union and organized the Young Communist League. In spite of armed attacks by local police and the murder of family members, she held the Sharecroppers Union together, fighting the exploitation by large farm owners. September 6, 1966. J.A. Rogers, Pan-Africanist historian and field anthropologist, crosses over. J.A. Rogers, a self-trained historian from Jamaica, was a Pullman porter on the railroad. He never finished high school. Rogers, when visiting various cities, would pay white Pullman conductors to go to the segregated libraries and take out books for him. Rogers also visited over 60 countries doing field research and writing articles about the conditions of African people worldwide. According to W.E.B. Du Bois, no man living has revealed so many important facts about the Negro race as has Rogers. Rogers published over 16 books, his most important being From Superman to Man, 100 Amazing Facts About the Negro, The Real Facts About Ethiopia, and World's Great Men of Color. September 6, 1972. La Raza Unida Party holds its first national convention in El Paso, Texas. La Raza Unida Party is the oldest progressive Chicano party in the United States. September 7, 1885. Jovita Ida de Juarez was born. Jovita was a Chicano journalist and fighter for Chicana and women's rights. With her newsman father and two brothers, she launched a vigorous investigation and demonstrations against the racist lynchings of Chicanos. Her family newspaper, La Crónica, was an early voice for social justice and equality. They fought white assimilation and promoted cultural pride, brown pride. She founded the Mexican Feminist League in 1911. September 7, 1974. Frelimo, Front for the Liberation of Mozambique, the African Socialist Liberation Movement, defeats the Portuguese and U.S.-backed attempt at a coup d'etat over the People's Democratic elected government. September 8, 1881. Helen Disha was born. Helen was a prolific Hawaiian composer, singer, and dancer who fought Euro-Christian missionaries as cultural imperialists as they banned native Hawaiian music and dance, including the hula, as being savage and bestial. September 9, 1948. The Korean People's Democratic Republic was founded. North Korea, one of the many socialist revolutions which characterized the post-colonial period. Today, North Korea maintains a staunch socialist political economic posture in the face of the United States and Western Europe's continued efforts at destabilization. September 9, 1882. Sarah Mapps Douglas, an African sister born in the United States, a teacher, abolitionist, and early member of the Free African Society. Sarah opened one of the first schools in Philadelphia in the 1820s, despite racist threats and violence. Sarah continued to teach young African girls in the Institute for Colored Youth, which she took charge of in 1853. September 10, 1979. Agostinho Neto, leader of the MPLA, Movement for the Liberation of Angola, crosses over to the ancestor world. MPLA was a vanguard African popular movement which led to the defeat and subsequent decolonization of the Portuguese. September 10th, 1974. Fatima Boaro crosses over. She was a guerrilla fighter and a leader in the PAIGC, the Revolutionary Liberation Movement for Guinea-Bissau, against Portuguese colonialism. Fatima joined the PAIGC after escaping from a forced marriage to a 73-year-old man when she was 19 years old. She helped architect the PAIGC, banning of forced marriages in the new revolutionary Guinea-Bissau. This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka here on KPFK 90.7 FM, Los Angeles 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, and streaming live worldwide at www.kpfk.org. And in the voice of our ancestors in Azania, South Africa, we say, Amandla awetu, Amandla awetu, Amandla awetu.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org, and with T. Mays, Associate Professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies, and History at Saginaw, Chippewa. He is also the author of the book, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Kyle Mays.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
Yes, looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So why did you write this book?
I think there's a few reasons. So I'll begin with a personal. I'm African American in Saginaw, Chippewa, Black American on my mom's side, and Saginaw, Chippewa on my dad's side. And growing up, it wasn't much of a contradiction being Black and Indigenous. It was a family heritage. My great-grandmother on my dad's side had come from the Saginaw Chippewa Reservation to the city of Detroit in 1940 and married my great-grandfather's African-American. And they became, or at least my great-grandmother became an activist and a respected elder in the city. And her daughter, my Aunt Judy Mays, founded the third ever public school in U.S. history with an indigenous curriculum called Medicine Mare American Indian Academy, which was founded in the 90s and had both Black, Afro-Indigenous, Indigenous children with mixed heritage from First Nations in Canada and the U.S. And it was very much supported by the Black community in the city of Detroit. And so for me growing up, it wasn't much of a contradiction until going to university. And then you start, some people begin to say, maybe you're not identifying as Black enough or not as Native enough. And, it's difficult for young people to kind of deal with. And I'm not related to the 5 tribes. And so I also wanted a book that explored the connection between enslavement and colonialism in a particular way that was not necessarily focused only on the story, which is important, of the 5 tribes, but that's not the only story on Afro-Indigenous relations. So again, the personal and then the larger questions of colonialism, settler colonialism in particular, and the history of enslavement and the aftermath of those particular social phenomena.
Now, you made reference to the 5 tribes. I take it you're referring to those such as the Cherokees, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, et al. How do they fit into your story?
Yeah, so while it's not a core feature of an Afro-Indigenous history of the United States, I talk about it more so at the end. It is a core discussion of understanding, in general, the African-American experience with Indigenous peoples, right? So a few things for folks to remember is that I remember being at in 2018, giving a talk in London, and there was a Black brother who, I was talking about Black and Native solidarity in the 20th century, and he interrupted me and said, well, the Indians enslaved us too. And of course, that's a focus on the 5 tribes that you just mentioned. And so and it's a complicated story, but to keep it short, the 5 tribes, again, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw, enslaved people of African descent for a few reasons. One, Europeans, and which turned into the United States, began to encroach on their land, and they wanted to show that they were civilized. Now, it's a curious way to show civilization, but they decided to enslave people of African descent to demonstrate their civilization and to hopefully keep some of their land. And they turned that into chattel slavery, which turned into, of course, a way of life from the early 19th century well into after the Trail of Tears. And then by 1866, after the end of the Civil War, in 1865, the United States sort of forced their hand in signing a treaty and forced them to make those former enslaved Africans citizens of the nation, which has had issues well into the contemporary time for what are called the freedmen, descendants of the 5 tribes who are still fighting for full citizenship and respecting a greater humanity within those particular tribal nations.
Now, who was Paul Cuffey, and how does he fit into your narrative?
So Paul Cuffey was, at least how I created in the narrative, in an Afro-Indigenous History of the United States, maritime, a great sailor, someone who was one of this first generation of Afro-Indigenous people. So he was the child of an Akan father, and from a mother who was Wampanoag, and one of these first people who were both Black and Indigenous by blood. And he ended up founding, or trying to create, on the one hand, both a sort of Black and Native town, which is unsuccessful, and then, of course, going to Sierra Leone in the early, late 18th, early 20th century. And he's an important person, and I remember reading about him as a kid, and I think most Black people at some point, when you study Black history, he's considered Black, but he is very much Indigenous as well. And I would say also Indigenous from his father's side, who was kidnapped and enslaved from the African continent and forced into labor into pre-revolutionary America. So he's a very important figure in that time, trying to grapple with the issues of anti-Blackness on the one hand, anti-Indigenous erasure, and trying to find some form of freedom within this particular changing nature of race and colonialism.
So Paul Cuffey emerged from the area that we oftentimes refer to as New England, and as you suggested, in the late 18th, early 19th century, he was one of the more well-established and affluent people of color in North America. And as I understand it, he was trying to transport people back to Africa. Is that accurate?
Yes, he was trying to transport them to Sierra Leone, and I forget the exact numbers, but it was just a few hundred people that they were able to, if not a few thousand, that they were able to successfully transport. And it began a movement in connection to the American Colonization Society and white folks at the time who wanted Black people to either leave the country at all, and also Black people with their own agency seeking some form of refuge outside of the rampant anti-Blackness of the time, and at least some form of opportunity. So he's very important in that particular discussion.
Now, you also discuss Frederick Douglass, the well-known mid-19th century abolitionist, a stellar figure in the history of North America, but you refer to his, quote, erasure, unquote, of the indigenous question. What do you mean by that? And is that erasure still occurring today?
Yeah, so in a speech that Frederick Douglass gave in May of 1869, and I believe it was called Let the Negro Alone, in front of the American Anti-Slavery Society in New York City, he talked about Haiti, and that's important to Black people, but he also made a particular point to say we are not going to die out like the Indians, and we're more like white people than we are like Indians. Now, when I say indigenous erasure, it's using, for Black people in this case, someone like Douglass, who's very keen on citizenship, Black humanity, and so forth. He used Native people's alleged disappearance. So in the late 19th century, there's a whole discussion of Native people disappearing. And so he used Native peoples and their supposed erasure to suggest that Black people had a future in the United States, whereas Native people did not have a future, and that Black people were more alike white people and were much stronger than Native peoples. So this is something that some of our great literary figures, such as James Baldwin, continued in a speech he gave in Cambridge in 1965, in a debate with William Buckley. It certainly goes well into the present in various ways. So we can talk about issues around mascots. We can talk about issues of discussion around land ownership, and even debates around reparations today, where we consider I'm in California, where people of African descent deserve some form of reparations, certainly, but upon whose land were people of African descent exploited, right? So it's a multi-layered issue that requires great detail and unraveling many of these contradictions.
Now, were there any prominent 19th century Black people who campaigned or protested against indigenous dispossession and genocide?
In the 19th century, that is hard to find. Certainly, I never want to say that did not exist, but at least in my own studies, and there are certainly probably individuals that I'm not thinking of right now, but it's hard to say as a collective that was a persistent thought. And it makes some sense because of how the United States orchestrated such a thing, where Black people are constantly dealing with these forms of anti-Blackness, enslavement, and even those who weren't enslaved are trying to create some form of live within a so-called democracy. And also Native people engaging in various forms of anti-Blackness as well across the board. So it's difficult to say. And I think one of the great examples in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction are the Buffalo Soldiers. And not to get too deep into that, but it's one of those things where at moments while they're doing the work of U.S. empire and wiping out indigenous nations, you have individuals or groups at other very temporal moments trying to protect different Native tribes as well.
Just as a footnote, my new book on Texas in the 19th century deals with that latter question you just mentioned. But in any case, to fast forward to the 20th century, what was the All-African People's Revolutionary Party? And we know that the late activist, known to many as Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, was a founder. And how did they approach the indigenous question?
Well, what I always liked about Kwame Ture, and of course the All-African Revolutionary People's Party, founded with the idea of socialism, of course, and the liberation, and Pan-Africanism and the liberation of Black people worldwide, throughout the diaspora, on the continent, and so forth. And the particular role that Kwame Ture had in his relationships with indigenous peoples is in many ways unparalleled for the time. In a speech he gave in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1975, and he titled it The Red and the Black. He made a particular point to say that this is indigenous people's land, and any sort of struggle that people of African descent deal with within the context of the U.S. should center indigenous people's land. And it's a profound moment for me, and I think very instructive for Black activists today to think about what does it mean to be in good solidarity, to not only challenge the core of white supremacy within the U.S., but also settler colonialism as well as an ongoing social, political, and economic structure. So they are very much profound in many sort of indigenous actions within the international realm from the late 1960s well into the 2000s.
So what was the Republic of New Africa, and how did they approach the indigenous question?
The Republic of New Africa was founded in May of 1968 in Detroit, and they wanted the 5 southern states for reparations for slavery and also cash payment as well. They wanted to be a nation within a nation. And they also decided to, so a major part of their idea of liberation was very deeply ingrained with the history of the Cherokee removal in particular. And so their ideology was centered on, we don't want to end up being like the 5 tribes, the Cherokee in particular, and be removed. And so we want our own particular nation. And that comes back to the question of erasure, which is still kind of a historical contradiction that hasn't been talked about enough or very much resolved. And that is, hypothetically, if they would have got that land, what does that say about Black people reproducing ideas of settler colonialism, even though they're trying to assert their own humanity and create a sense of home and belonging?
Now, you say in the book that you've read Malcolm X's autobiography repeatedly, and that brings us to the question of what was Malcolm X's approach to the indigenous question, and likewise, what was the Nation of Islam's approach to the indigenous question?
Well, of course, as you know, they're Black nationalists, and land was a central part of their identity. Trying to get land, talking about land, trying to create a separate nation, and so forth. And so, at least a few occasions in the autobiography of Malcolm X, at moments, I think, parroting what Elijah Muhammad taught him, but also creating his own political ideology of Black nationalism, made a claim that is dubious but rooted in some fact about how Native peoples sold the Manhattan, present-day Manhattan, to the Dutch, and that being a great source of wealth for capitalists well into the 20th century today. So they use these sort of histories of Native peoples in the past and not discussing them in the present to, again, create this notion of Black belonging. And so that is how Malcolm X and others in the Nation of Islam discuss land and their relationship to land.
Now, what about your campus, UCLA? Are there indigenous languages taught there?
The indigenous languages that I know of being taught at UCLA are Quechua. I'm not certain, but I'm pretty certain that there are no California native languages, which is another question and dynamic about the erasure of Tonga Gabrielino people, who are the local indigenous, who are not federally recognized tribal nation within Southern California, in LA in particular. So, but it's mostly Quechua, Central and South American languages as far as indigenous languages.
And of course, your UCLA colleague, Benjamin Matlin, written comprehensively on genocide against the indigenous of California. Now, finally, Kyle T. Mays, professor of African American Studies, American Indian Studies and History at UCLA, author of the book, in Afro-Indigenous history of the United States of America and happening to be of African and Saginaw Chippewa descent, what is your counsel to the youth in our audience who would like to walk in your footsteps in the 21st century?
I think if I would offer any counsel, I think I would suggest that you find a community of people who challenge you and support you at the same time, and challenge you to continue to learn, to think about history, and also think about the future, right? I want to live in a world where we no longer have to deal with issues of white supremacy, settler colonialism, and so forth. And so I think having a community, and also being very humble, being a very humble person who continues to learn and wants to help humanity move forward. Those are some of the things that I would encourage young people to do.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Kyle T. Mays, author of the book Afro-Indigenous History of the United States. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
You're tuned in to 90.7 FM, KPFK in Los Angeles, and on the web at kpfk.org. And now we go to Prison Radio with Mumia Abu-Jamal and Oahu Water Protectors. In the past 6 months alone, the United Snakes government has given $44 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to Ukraine, and under its governmental structure of white supremacy, has told the people of Jackson, Mississippi to quote-unquote not drink the contaminated water. In suit with intentionally ignoring Flint, Michigan, and silencing the outreach of Oahu Water Protectors' voices from the admittedly stolen lands of the Hawaiian Islands.
When the environment turns, floods are ravaging Mississippi, while expensive droughts are occurring out west. The areas in between are held in the sweaty grip of a heat wave. In Europe, hundreds of people die from the excessive heat. Climate change, sometimes called global warming, is a reality. Meanwhile, politicians who poo-poo the idea of climate change now sound incredibly stupid. They sounded like apologists for industrialists as the earth simmers. It also seems like political semi-solutions, like treaties and promises of lessened environmental damage, are too little and much too late. Similarly, scientific predictions of ice melts were so conservative that they badly understated the problems facing human populations. Simply put, capitalism kills. The unrestrained search for unlimited profits have endangered the air, water, temperatures, and water levels around the world. And human populations are facing survival threats that can't be met by America's formidable war machine. Perhaps the planting of millions of trees and making human habitats green spaces could delay the coming environmental carnage. Perhaps. With love, not fear, this is Mumia Abu-Jamal.
We will now hear from Oahu Water Protectors about the current and ongoing crises, the U.S. Navy's deadly Navy fuel leak, and an update on the Indigenous Hawaiian fight at Red Hill against the U.S. Navy, and Freedom Now stands in solidarity.
It's constructed that the military is here to protect us, but we've been nothing but a target since they've arrived here. And it's very poignant that the Navy is poisoning our aquifer, because the Navy is actually the folks that overthrew our government on the USS Boston and pointed guns at our queen.
In 1965, the Navy decided to use this portion of the southwest coast of Kaho'olawe to test the effects of a simulated atomic bomb.
we saw this crater, and it was like, couldn't believe our eyes that somebody, a bomb could do that.
When I went there, I cried. Every time I go there, I tear up.
There's this ship called the USS Arizona still leaking oil to this day. And the only reason why the United States military doesn't want to stop the oil leaking is because they want to commemorate it as a historical event that'll live on forever. So them continuing to poison our waters is something that they do to be patriotic towards the occupation of Hawaii.
The U.S. Navy have been poisoning the waters not just in Red Hill, but also the waters of Pu'uloa. The reason that it was called Pearl Harbor to begin with is because it was plentiful with pearl oysters and fish, and now it is home to 6 Superfund sites. They actually had to narrow it down from several dozen contaminated sites because of the military presence there. What was once one of the most abundant areas on the island is now one of the most contaminated sites on the planet.
At least 1,500 other families in Honolulu started seeing fuel in their water about 2 weeks ago. According to the Navy, the fuel came from the Red Hill Fuel Facility, which was built during World War II. That leaky fuel facility sits only 100 feet over a major aquifer that supplies water to Honolulu.
There is still at least 180 million gallons of fuel in those tanks right now that are supposed to be removed. These tanks are in their end-of-life phase. Along a certain time horizon, there's a 100% chance that there will be a catastrophic failure. It would basically spell out the end of clean water and a way of life on Oahu as we know it.
Military leaders are talking about the need for a permanent high-powered radar on Oahu, but there's concern from residents who would live nearby.
The Missile Defense Agency is studying 3 proposed sites for a $1.5 billion high-powered radar site.
In the back of me is a Kahukumoto cross track that went its way all around the mountains, and right above it is a proposed site for the HDR Hawaii radar. For me, this monstrous project, which would take about 160 acres, what really bothered me is that it would be displacing so many wildlife. It would create a traffic nightmare with the possibility of over 100 employees every day. And then the worst thing about it is that initially when they made this proposal, they had mentioned only 3 storage fuel tanks with the capacity of 10,000 gallons per tank. But at our last meeting, they upped the game by saying now there's going to be 10 fuel tanks with the capacity to hold 25,000 gallons of fuel per tank, and that's 250,000 gallons of fuel. To me, 10 tanks is a little bit more than just for the radar.
Military leaders say they're listening to community concerns and committed to building sustainable projects.
And when we train, we clean up. That may not have been done long ago, but we've learned from those, mistakes of the past. And making sure that we don't perpetuate those mistakes, but we perpetuate the right way of doing business. And that is to ensure that we're responsible stewards.
The March torrential rains of 2021 destroyed many areas between Hauula and Wailua. The rains came down so hard, it was like rapids. It was a really scary situation. So we know when the fuel tanks leak, everything from the mountain to the ocean washes down. So, like Red Hill, some kind of catastrophe can happen with those tanks. Human error or not, it will be devastating. We use the word solidarity. You stand together as one voice. And when the issue of Red Hill came up, we decided that we needed to stand in solidarity because we don't want to be looked upon as, oh, not in my backyard, because it is not good for anywhere on the islands. And that's what got me started. A lot of the delegates kept telling us, oh yeah, don't worry about it, Linnell, don't worry about it, it's gonna go to Kauai. How rude of them, and how so very wrong. We don't want it at KTA1, and we certainly don't want it on Kauai. No more. There's just way too many issues. It's time that more locals really and truly find their voices and speak up.
This is Gerald Horne for KPFK, kpfk.org. And with me on the line is Professor Christina Dickerson-Cousin, Assistant Professor of History at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, and author of the book, Black Indians and Freedmen, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and Indigenous Americans, 1816 to 1916. Welcome to Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Dickerson-Cousin.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book?
Well, so this story really begins in 2004. So I finished Spelman College with my degree in history. And as a part of that degree, I took a course on Native American history. So I was already interested in that topic. So then after college, I took a year off in between college and graduate school. And during that intervening time, I was a research assistant in the Department of Research and Scholarship of the AME Church. My father, Dennis C. Dickerson, at the time, was the executive director of that department, also known as the historiographer's office. And so while I was there, I did all kinds of historical requests. And during my, off times, I would look at old Christian Recorder reels. So the Christian Recorder is the newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And so we have, microfilm going all the way back, decades and decades and decades. And so I would just look at those in my off time. And I kept seeing references to the Indian Mission Annual Conference. And I had never heard of that before. And so as I continued digging into that, this story just unfolded over, many years. I finally went to graduate school in 2005. And so this was not actually my dissertation topic. My dissertation topic was something completely different. But then after I finished graduate school, I returned to this project that had really kind of grabbed my attention, and over many years of research was able to come up with this book.
Mm-hmm. Now, the site of your book is today's Oklahoma, once known as Indian Territory, where the so-called civilized tribes, quote unquote, had been enslaving Africans, yet the AME was seeking to Christianize and missionize amongst former enslavers. Was this complicated?
Yeah, so it's a very complex story. So the way this unfolds is that there were, of course, people of African descent enslaved by these 5 tribes. And one of these people was named Annie Keel, and she was someone who was enslaved by a Chickasaw master. And so after she became free, she was very interested in bringing the AME Church to Indian Territory to evangelize among her community of people of African and Indigenous descent, like her. And so she was able to communicate with the chief of the Choctaw Nation at the time, Allen Wright, and he reached out to African Methodists in Arkansas. And so African Methodists started coming to Indian Territory from Arkansas, and then that effort just continued over many years. So really the AME Church came to Indian Territory at the request of this woman, Annie Keel, a woman of African and Indigenous heritage who wanted the AME Church to be among her community.
Now, which indigenous grouping was most susceptible to AME appeals? Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, Creek, which and why?
Well, I would say certainly initially you see a lot of movement among the Creek. So, Annie Keel, who initiated bringing the AME Church, she was a Chickasaw freedman, but nevertheless, you see a lot of development in the Creek Nation. And that could be for a variety of reasons. I believe that a lot of that was because there was already such an established system of Creek freedmen having significant roles in, governance. There were, I believe, 3 Black Creek towns, and like North Fork Colored, etc. And so there was that already existing system of people of African descent and indigenous descent having that kind of role. So I think that maybe is why you see so much interest from that particular tribal nation. But again, you see a lot of this growth among all the tribes.
Now, did many of the people of African descent speak indigenous languages? How widespread was this phenomenon? And was there any particular indigenous language that they spoke more than others?
Well, it's hard to quantify that precisely, but we know from records and from oral history that there certainly were people who spoke indigenous languages. Keep in mind that for many of these people, an indigenous language may have been their first language. I came across a woman who said she only spoke the Creek language until she was about 12. And so it makes perfect sense that she and, maybe her children would have that, that knowledge. So it just, depends on the person, how long they've, been among that particular tribal nation, how much, retention there was over time. But yeah, there certainly were people among those tribes who were of African descent, African and indigenous descent sometimes, who spoke those languages. Absolutely.
Now, I wonder if today there is any remnant amongst the Black people of Oklahoma of their speaking indigenous languages, or even incorporating words from indigenous languages into their speaking of English. Have you run across anything like that?
Actually, yes. So a significant part of my research came through my connection with the now deceased, God rest him, Reverend Lonnie Johnson. He was a retired presiding elder in the AME Church and was a descendant of, Chickasaw freedmen, Chickasaw and Choctaw freedmen. And so I went in 2015 to visit him and his family and spent a good bit of time with him and doing a lot of interviews with him. And just in the course of those interviews, there were some words that he said that I later figured out were, of that derivation of that Chickasaw Choctaw derivation. And then just based on things I've been told, there are people who are familiar with those languages today. But again, I don't really have a way to quantify that. But there are certainly freedmen, descendants who are around today who certainly could answer that question better than I can.
Now, there are a number of all Black towns that were created in Oklahoma. That is to say, what was formerly Indian Territory becoming the state of Oklahoma by 1907. There's Boley, Oklahoma, for example. And how did these all Black towns relate to their indigenous neighbors?
Yeah, so these are fascinating, sites of inquiry. Boley is a, really interesting place to study. So what you see with these all Black towns oftentimes is that they were created in part off of land allotments that freedmen were given. And so there is that connection with the freedmen community and then African-American migrants who come to these towns. So oftentimes, again, these all Black towns will start on a land allotment given to one of these freedmen. And so there's that connection. You also see, however, that there was sometimes tension between these African-American migrants and the freedmen living in these towns and the tribal nations who felt that this land was theirs and that these people should not be living on them. So you see that reflected in the documents, that they would feel that they were under siege, that there would be attacks, but that was a result of some people feeling that they should not be there.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned allotments, and that brings us to the Dawes Act and the Dawes Commission. What was the Dawes Act? What was the Dawes Commission, and what impact did it have on Black-Indian relations?
Yeah, so essentially what the Dawes Commission does, starting in the late 19th century, going up through the early 20th century, is that it forces these 5 civilized tribes to allot their land, which basically means instead of holding land in common, the government wants to break up the land into, plots, individual plots for specific families. And in this way, undermine tribal sovereignty and, communal land ownership, which had been typical among these tribes. And so in order to determine who would get an allotment, the Dawes Commission decided to figure out who officially qualified as a member of that tribe. And so towards that end, the Dawes Commission came up with these citizenship roles. So if you were a person of, a freedman, you would, go to the Dawes Commission and have your, evidence saying that I was born in this year, I was enslaved by this person. And then if you are able to get enough, evidence to support that, the Dawes Commission would say, okay, you're officially on the freedman rolls, you are officially considered a part of this tribe, of this tribal nation. And so that is how freedmen would get allotments. It's a very messy process. It's a very imperfect process. And in many ways, we're still dealing with the repercussions of that messy process. But that was the means by which these freedmen were able to get land in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also discussed the AME evangelizing in West Africa and Haiti. How successful were they at those sites compared to Indian Territory and Oklahoma?
Well, it's during this early phase, during this period that I cover in the book, much of these efforts in the Caribbean and in West Africa and later South Africa are not fully funded. In Haiti, for example, you would send people over there and they would stay. Oftentimes they didn't have the language facility to really be, fully successful. But the church, for, many reasons, in large part because the church just didn't have the money to fully fund some of these missionary efforts. So you would just have an ambitious person want to go over there and establish a church, and maybe they would, but then maybe they would come back to the United States, and then someone would come back a couple years later and the church was gone. So it was, not a, consistent effort in this phase that I cover in my book. This does change a bit over time, but that kind of goes beyond the scope of my book. But yeah, this is all happening at the same time in this same context.
Now, talk to us about the colleges that the AME created, a number of which are still in existence, such as Morris Brown in Atlanta, or Paul Quinn in Texas. Did the indigenous attend any of these colleges? And talk to us as well about the schools created by the AME in Indian Territory.
Absolutely. So what I argue in the book is that part of the reason that Annie Keel and other freedmen wanted the AME Church in their community is because of the AME Church's long-standing commitment to higher education. By the time the AME Church does go to Indian Territory, their flagship school, Wilberforce University, had already been established for, several decades. And so they're saying, okay, yeah, we're in this period where we are finally free. We want our children to be able to go to school. We perhaps want to go to school. And so seeing the long history that the AME Church has with institutions of higher education, that is part of why Annie Keel and others wanted the AME Church to come. So easily the most successful effort towards higher education in Indian Territory, later Oklahoma, was the Sisson Industrial Institute, which was named after one of the most prolific AME missionaries or ministers in the Indian Mission Conference. And ironically, he was actually a white man. His name was James Fitzallen Sisson, and he has, a long, complex story with the AME Church that I highlight in the book. But ultimately, he's one of the first ministers who comes and spends consistent time in Indian Territory. And he was a tireless advocate for education. And so when the church establishes this, educational institution, they name it after Sisson. Eventually, it changes a bit and becomes known as Flipper Key Davis University and later Flipper Key Davis Junior College. And so we certainly have evidence that freedmen and freedmen descendants attended this school. And so you do certainly see that desire of that generation of Annie Keel and those like her coming to fruition with the establishment of this school and its continuation.
Now, is it proper to infer from your remarks that Indigenous attended Paul Quinn and Morris Brown at some point?
I honestly am not sure. I've never delved into that in particular. I know that there were Indigenous students at Hampton University, which is, of course, not an AME school, but I just do not know if they attended any others.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked a moment or two ago about evangelizing in South Africa, which brings us to Bishop Henry McNeill Turner. Talk to us about his experience in South Africa at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah, so he is seeking to establish a more consistent effort on the continent. As I alluded to before, the AME Church had been making these kinds of efforts for a long time, but for reasons of funding and other things, lack of language facility, etc., there just had not been a lot of consistency with it. And so Henry McNeill Turner, he wants to change that. He believes it is critically important for the AME Church to encompass the continent. And so he, seeks that effort. He visits West Africa, he visits South Africa, and he is able to more firmly plant African Methodism in those locations. So it's that in and of itself is a whole other book. And there are, I actually just recently wrote an article about this that hopefully will be coming out at some point. But it is important to know for this book that all this is happening in the same context. And Henry McNeill Turner actually presides over Indian Territory in 1880, beginning in 1880. So he's there from 1880 until 1884, serving as the bishop. And so he has those experiences in mind by the time he's, going to the continent. So it all informs his efforts as a bishop and certainly is an important part of his story.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Dickerson-Cousin, author of the book Black Indians and Freedmen, the AME Church and Indigenous Americans, 1816 to 1916. Tell us about the relations today between the AME Church and Oklahoma and indigenous folk, etc.
Yeah, so there are many AME churches in Oklahoma today. There are descendants of freedmen who are a part of AME churches. There is not a specific, as far as I know, a specific effort to reach out to, freedmen descendants, but they are still very much a part of the fabric of African Methodism in Oklahoma. As I mentioned before, Lonnie Johnson, his family, very steeped in African Methodism. He was a retired presiding elder, and he was, as AME as they come. Andy Keel, who I mentioned before, was one of his ancestors. And so that's just one indication of the longevity of African Methodism within these Black and Indigenous communities. And so again, we still have, freedmen descendants, a part of the denomination, but as far as I know, there's not a specific, effort towards them in terms of, what we saw in the 19th and early 20th century.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Dickerson-Cousin, author of the book Black Indians and Freedmen. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Kyle T. Mays, Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin, our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Femi, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon, our engineers, Yao and Wendell, and all those who made today's program possible. Stay tuned for our sister Sumta with Spotlight Africa coming up next. Signing off for Freedom Now. This is Sister Thage. Stay safe, cool, and support our people fighting for clean drinking water over this long weekend especially, and forward ever. Until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.